The air hung thick with moisture as the sun climbed over the canopy of what would one day be called East Africa. But on this particular morning, 5.2 million years before the rise of cities, before agriculture, before even the first stone tools would be carefully crafted by thoughtful hands, the world belonged to creatures caught between two destinies. In a clearing surrounded by towering trees whose species would vanish long before humans learned to write their names, a small band of primates stirred from their nests. They were not quite apes. They were not quite human. They were something in between, something the fossil record would later struggle to fully capture, existing in that profound moment of evolutionary transition when our ancestors stood at a crossroads they could never have comprehended. Let me take you there. Let me show you the world as it existed on the day that would fracture history into before and after. The dominant male rose first, his body covered in coarse hair that gleamed copper in the early light. Standing perhaps 4 feet tall when upright, which he did more often than his distant cousins still living entirely in the trees, he surveyed his small family group with eyes that held something new in the animal kingdom. Not quite consciousness as we would recognize it, but not mere instinct either. Something was awakening behind those eyes, something that would, in time, reach for the stars. But not yet. Not on this morning. On this morning, he was concerned only with the immediate. The night had been restless. Strange sounds had echoed from the valley below, sounds his kind had learned to fear. The deep, rumbling cough of a predator unlike any that exists in our modern world. Dinofelis, the false saber-toothed cat, had been hunting near their territory. 2 nights prior, the youngest member of their band had vanished. They had heard her screams cut short in the darkness. The females emerged from their sleeping nests, cradling infants that clung to their bodies with tiny, desperate fingers. There were 12 individuals in total, a typical family group for these early hominids. 12 souls balanced on the knife's edge of extinction, as all life has always been. But who on this day would stumble into a discovery that would tilt the balance of nature itself? They descended from their sleeping trees with practiced caution. The ground was dangerous. It had always been dangerous. For millions of years, their ancestors had found safety in the branches, in the high places where the great predators could not reach. But something had been changing. The forests were retreating. The climate was shifting. To survive, they had been forced to adapt, to spend more time on the ground, to develop new strategies for existence in an increasingly open landscape. This adaptation would save them, but it would also doom countless other species that could not compete with what they would become. The morning feeding began as it always did. They moved through the tall grass toward a grove of fig trees, communicating in soft hoots and gestures. Their language, if you could call it that, consisted of perhaps 24 distinct vocalizations and a handful of deliberate hand movements. Compared to the complexity that would come, it was nothing. Compared to the silence of most animals, it was everything. One of the juveniles, a curious male not yet old enough to challenge for dominance, but old enough to wander, noticed something unusual. In a clearing where lightning had struck during the storm 3 nights before, smoke still rose from a smoldering log. He approached cautiously, his nostrils flaring at the acrid smell. Fire was not unknown to these creatures. They had seen it before when lightning split the sky, had watched forests burn, had learned to flee from it as all animals did. But they had never considered it as anything other than a force of destruction, a terror to escape. The juvenile reached out tentatively, then jerked his hand back as the heat became uncomfortable. He hooted in surprise, a vocalization that brought two others to investigate. They stood in a semicircle, staring at the glowing embers with an attention span that would have been impossible for their ancestors just a few million years earlier. And then something extraordinary happened. A gust of wind stirred the ashes. A small flame leapt up, crackling with sudden life. In that flame, reflected in 6 primitive eyes, danced the future of planet Earth. But they did not know this. They could not know this. They knew only that the bright, moving thing was mesmerizing in a way nothing else had ever been. The dominant male arrived, alerted by the unusual commotion. His first instinct was to drive his band away from this dangerous phenomenon. He raised himself to his full height, preparing to bark a warning. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the warmth radiating from the embers on what had been a cool morning. Perhaps it was simply the hypnotic dance of the flames. Whatever the reason, he did not give the command to flee. Instead, he sat down, and he watched. The others, taking their cue from their leader, did the same. For perhaps 20 minutes, an eternity in the attention span of early hominids, they sat in a rough circle around the dying fire, watching it flicker and fade. When a beetle, disturbed by the commotion, crawled too close to the embers and began to sizzle, filling the air with an unfamiliar but not unpleasant smell, something stirred in the mind of the dominant male. He had smelled that smell before, after lightning fires in the forest. He had found burned animals and, driven by hunger, had tasted their flesh. It had been different from raw meat, softer, easier to chew, more flavorful. But never had he connected that distant memory to the fire itself. The leap of understanding required was simply too great. The cognitive gap between seeing burned meat and understanding that fire creates burned meat might seem trivial to us, but it represented a chasm as wide as the one between the first single-celled organisms and the first multicellular life. Yet on this morning, in this clearing, in the mind of this nameless creature who would leave no fossils for us to study, no DNA for us to sequence, that connection began to form. He did not act on it, not yet. The fire was dying, and with it, the moment passed. The band moved on to their feeding grounds, and the day proceeded as countless days had proceeded before. They foraged for fruits, insects, and the occasional small animal they could catch. They groomed each other. They squabbled over status and mating rights. They watched the horizon for predators. But the dominant male kept glancing back toward the clearing where the fire had been. And in his primitive brain, something new was growing. Not a thought exactly, not yet a plan, but a connection, a possibility, a door opening onto a future that would remake the world. As the sun reached its zenith and the heat of the African day became oppressive, the band retreated to the shade of a large acacia tree. Some dozed. Others continued grooming. The infants played, practicing the skills they would need to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. None of them knew that by the time darkness fell on this day, everything would be different. None of them could have conceived that within the span of a single rotation of the earth, they would cross a threshold that no species had ever crossed before. They were about to steal something from the gods themselves. They were about to tame fire. But first, they would have to survive the afternoon. And in the tall grass beyond their resting place, something large was moving. Something with teeth designed to shear through flesh and bones. Something that had been watching them since dawn. The afternoon of the last ordinary day in the history of life on Earth was about to become very interesting indeed. The hunt and the discovery. The shadow moved through the grass with a patience that only apex predators possess. Dinofelis, the false saber-tooth, was a killing machine perfected by millions of years of evolution. Larger than a modern leopard, with partially retractable claws and canines that could puncture skulls, it had been stalking this particular band of hominids for 3 days. It had already taken one of their young. Now it had returned for more. The creature's spotted coat rippled as muscles tensed beneath the skin. Its yellow eyes, positioned forward for binocular vision, focused on the smallest adult female in the group. She sat apart from the others, distracted by an infant nursing at her chest. Isolated, vulnerable, perfect. But the Dinofelis had underestimated its prey in one crucial way. These were not the same hominids it had hunted for years. Something in their lineage had shifted, some mutation in the brain structure that governed attention and threat detection. They were more aware, more vigilant, more collectively conscious of danger. The juvenile male who had first approached the fire that morning suddenly froze. His head swiveled toward the grass where nothing visible moved. His nostrils flared. Every muscle in his small body went rigid. Then he screamed. It was not the simple alarm call of a monkey spotting a predator. It was something more complex, more urgent, more specific. In that scream was encoded information: predator, large, feline, close, ground level. The others didn't need to see the threat to know exactly what kind of death was approaching. The band exploded into chaos. Females grabbed infants. Males positioned themselves between the threat and their families. The dominant male bellowed a challenge, making himself as large as possible, displaying the strength that had earned him his position. The Dinofelis, its ambush ruined, made its decision in a fraction of a second. It burst from the grass in a spray of dirt and vegetation, its powerful hindquarters propelling it forward at terrifying speed. Its target had changed. Now it was focused on the juvenile who had given the alarm. Young, slow, easy. But the juvenile was already moving. Unlike his ancestors who would have blindly fled, he ran with purpose, angling toward the largest tree in the clearing. His hands found bark. His fingers, longer and more dexterous than those of true apes, gripped with desperate strength. He began to climb. The Dinofelis reached the base of the tree just as the juvenile pulled himself beyond reach. The great cat reared up on its hind legs, swiping at the air where the young hominid had been moments before. Its claws raked bark, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The dominant male, seeing an opportunity, did something that would have been unthinkable for most prey animals. He picked up a rock, not a small pebble, but a stone the size of a human fist, and he threw it. His aim was terrible. The rock sailed past the Dinofelis and shattered against a tree trunk. But the action itself was revolutionary. Tool use, projectile weapons, abstract thinking connecting cause and effect across space and time. These concepts, these abilities, they were fragmenting the barrier between animal and something new. Other males followed his lead. Suddenly, the air was filled with flying stones, sticks, and whatever debris came to hand. Most missed. A few struck glancing blows. One, thrown by the second-ranking male, hit the Dinofelis squarely on the nose. The predator yowled in surprise and pain. This was wrong. This was not how prey behaved. Prey ran. Prey screamed. Prey died. Prey did not fight back with stones falling from the sky like angry rain. The Dinofelis made a tactical retreat, backing away from the tree while keeping its eyes locked on the hominids. It was not giving up. It was reassessing. It would return after dark, when these strange, stone-throwing creatures were blind and vulnerable. It always returned. But it would not get the chance. The band did not celebrate their victory because they knew it was not a victory at all. It was a postponement. When darkness came, the Dinofelis would have every advantage. The trees where they normally slept were too far away to reach before nightfall. They were trapped in this clearing with a predator that had marked them for death. The dominant male's primitive mind worked through the problem. His thinking was not like ours, not the clear sequential logic of modern humans. It was more like watching shadows on a cave wall, fragmentary images and associations that sometimes, rarely, connected into something approaching insight. Fire. He remembered the fire from the morning. He remembered how it had made him feel warm. He remembered something else, something from seasons past. After a great lightning fire had swept through the forest, for many days afterward, they had seen no predators in the burned areas. The scent of smoke seemed to keep the dangerous animals away. Could the fire do that? Could it protect them the way the trees protected them? The thought was almost too complex to hold in his mind. It kept slipping away, replaced by more immediate concerns. But it kept returning, insistent, like an itch that demanded scratching. He stood up and began walking back toward the clearing where the fire had been that morning. The others followed, confused but trusting. Trust was another new thing, another mutation in the social fabric that was weaving itself into something unprecedented. When they reached the clearing, the dominant male felt a crushing disappointment that he lacked the vocabulary to express. The fire was gone. Nothing remained but cold ash and charred wood. The others looked at him, waiting for direction, for leadership, for an answer to the problem of the coming night. He had no answer. He had only a memory of warmth and light and the strange smell that had driven the beetle to its death. He knelt down and touched the ash. It was cold, dead. Whatever magic had been here was gone. But the juvenile, the curious one who had first approached the fire, did something unexpected. He began digging through the ash with his hands, pushing aside the gray powder, searching for something he could not have named. His fingers found a coal, a chunk of wood that had not fully burned. It was still warm in the center. He held it up, showing the others. It meant nothing to them. A piece of burned wood, useless. But the juvenile turned it over in his hands, feeling the residual heat, seeing how the red glow still lived in cracks along its surface. And then, driven by an impulse that came from nowhere and everywhere, he blew on it. The coal brightened. Orange light pulsed through the cracks. Smoke curled upward. The juvenile hooted in surprise and delight, and blew again. The coal glowed brighter still. The dominant male understood before the others. This was fire, not dead, sleeping, and it could be awakened. He took the coal from the juvenile and placed it carefully on a piece of bark. Then, working with a deliberation that seemed to surprise even himself, He began gathering dry grass and small twigs, piling them around the coal. He had seen fire consume these things. Perhaps they could feed it. Perhaps they could make it grow again. His first attempts failed. He smothered the coal with too much material. It dimmed and nearly died. The band watched with growing anxiety as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Soon the Dinofelis would return. Soon the darkness would swallow them. But the dominant male tried again, this time with less material, this time blowing gently on the coal as the juvenile had done. A wisp of smoke rose from the dry grass. Then a tiny flame, no bigger than his fingernail, flickered into existence. The others gasped, a sound of wonder that had probably never been made before in the history of the world. The dominant male, encouraged, blew again. The flame spread to a second piece of grass, then a third. Small sticks began to catch. Within minutes, they had a fire. It was pathetic compared to the blaze that lightning had created. It was tiny and fragile, and threatened to die with every gust of wind. But it was theirs. They had made it. They had brought the fire back from death. They had stolen the secret of the gods. As darkness fell over the African landscape, 12 hominids sat in a circle around their small fire, feeding it sticks and grass, watching it dance and flicker. The warmth pushed back the evening chill. The light created a bubble of safety in the encroaching darkness. And somewhere in the night beyond, the Dinofelis prowled and snarled, but came no closer. Fire frightened it in a way that these ape creatures never had. Fire meant danger. Fire meant pain. Fire meant flee. The predator that had hunted them for 3 days turned away and sought easier prey. It would never hunt these particular hominids again. And within a few thousand years, the Dinofelis itself would be extinct, outcompeted by predators less powerful but more adaptable, by predators that no longer feared the dark. The first night of light. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the vast darkness above. Each ember that rose seemed to mirror the stars beginning to emerge in the African sky, creating a connection between earth and heaven that would, in time, inspire religions, philosophies, and scientific revolutions. But on this night, the 12 hominids gathered around their small flame had no such grand thoughts. They had only wonder, fear, and an instinct that was slowly crystallizing into something approaching understanding. The dominant male had not moved from his position beside the fire for over an hour. His eyes tracked every flicker of the flame, every shift in the glowing coals. When the fire began to dim, panic seized him. He grabbed more sticks, more grass, piling them on frantically. Too much again. The fire nearly suffocated beneath the weight of fuel. But he was learning. Each mistake taught him something. Each success reinforced a pattern. The fire needed to breathe. The fire needed fuel, but not too much. The fire needed tending, constant vigilance, or it would die and leave them vulnerable once more. This was perhaps the most revolutionary realization of all. Fire was not simply a tool to be used and discarded. Fire was alive in a way nothing else was. It consumed, it grew, it could die, and it demanded care. Without realizing it, these primitive beings had just invented responsibility. The females, initially terrified of the flames, had gradually moved closer. The warmth was too seductive to resist, especially as the night grew colder. One of the mothers discovered that if she positioned herself just right, the heat could warm her infant without exposing it to the flames themselves. Others copied her position. Within an hour, the entire band had arranged themselves in an optimal configuration around the fire, each individual finding the perfect balance between warmth and safety. They were learning to live with fire, and fire was learning to live with them. The juvenile who had first blown on the coal sat transfixed by the dancing flames. His young brain, more plastic and adaptable than the adult's, was forming connections at a furious rate. He watched how certain types of wood burned faster than others. He noticed that green leaves created smoke but little flame, while dry grass ignited instantly but burned out quickly. He observed that larger logs burned longer but needed smaller fuel to ignite them first. He was conducting experiments. He was gathering data. He was thinking scientifically, centuries before science would be invented. As the night deepened, something unexpected happened. The band began to relax in a way they never had after dark. For millions of years, nightfall had meant terror. It meant huddling silently in trees, hoping the darkness would pass without bringing death. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow concealed possible doom. Sleep came in brief, anxious fragments, always one sense alert for danger. But tonight, with the fire pushing back the darkness, with the warmth replacing the chill, with the light revealing rather than concealing, something in their ancient fear began to dissolve. One of the females began grooming her mate. Another played gently with her infant, making soft cooing sounds. The second-ranking male, usually tense and watchful in the dominant male's presence, actually yawned and stretched his arms above his head. They were experiencing leisure. They were discovering that time could be more than mere survival, that existence could contain moments of peace, of pleasure, of simple being rather than constant becoming. This, too, would change everything. The dominant male, exhausted from the day's terror and triumph, finally allowed himself to recline against a log. He kept one hand near the fire, ready to feed it if needed, but his eyes began to droop. Around him, others were settling into sleep. Real sleep. Deep sleep. The kind of restorative rest that builds strong bodies and sharp minds. But not everyone slept. The juvenile and two others remained awake, mesmerized by the flames. And in their watching, something profound was happening. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, always seeking meaning in chaos, always trying to impose order on randomness. And fire, with its endlessly shifting forms, its hypnotic dance of light and shadow, was the perfect canvas for an awakening imagination. In the flames, the juvenile began to see things, not just fire, but shapes, faces, animals, stories playing out in the dancing light. His brain was hallucinating, making connections that did not exist, seeing significance in pure chance. This tendency, this weakness in our cognitive wiring, this bug in the software of consciousness, would eventually give birth to art, mythology, religion, and abstract thought itself. But first, it would give birth to dreams. As the juvenile's eyes grew heavy and his consciousness began to slip into sleep, the images from the fire followed him. In his dreams, he saw a great flame that stretched to the sky. He saw his band, not 12 but hundreds, thousands, all gathered around fires too numerous to count. He saw the Dinophilus burning, fleeing, vanishing into smoke. He saw things that made no sense, that his waking mind could never have conceived, that were both terrifying and glorious in their strangeness. He was having humanity's first nightmare, and humanity's first vision of the future. Somewhere around midnight, a sound rippled through the darkness. The sawing cough of a leopard, distant but distinct. Every hominid instantly woke, hearts pounding, bodies tense for flight. The dominant male was on his feet in an instant, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. But the leopard did not approach. It called again, from a different direction, and then fell silent. It was hunting, but not hunting them. The fire had made them invisible to predators, or at least unpalatable. They were no longer prey to be stalked. They were something new, something dangerous, something to be avoided. The realization spread through the group like ripples on still water. They were safe, truly safe. For the first time in their lives, for the first time in the history of their species, darkness did not mean helplessness. One of the older females made a sound, a vocalization that started as a simple expression of relief, but then transformed into something more complex. Other voices joined hers, creating a harmony that was not quite music, but was no longer mere animal noise. They were celebrating. They were expressing joy. They were creating culture. The song, if you could call it that, lasted only a few minutes before trailing off into silence. But it had happened. Sound had been used not to convey immediate survival information, but to express emotion, to create social bonds, to mark a moment as significant. Language was being born around this fire. Not fully formed, not yet complex enough to convey abstract ideas, but taking its first stumbling steps from necessity toward art. As the celebration faded, the band settled back around the fire. The dominant male added more wood, his movements now practiced and confident. He had become the first firekeeper, a role that would evolve into priest, scientist, and guardian of civilization. The responsibility weighed on him without his understanding why. He knew only that the fire must not die, that its death would mean their death, that his purpose now was to keep the light burning. The night wore on. The fire burned steady, and in the sky above, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to the revolution happening below. They had witnessed the birth and death of countless species, had looked down on trilobites and dinosaurs, on the first fish to crawl onto land, and the first mammals to scurry beneath the feet of giants. But tonight, they witnessed something unprecedented. Tonight, a species had broken free from the tyranny of biological limitation. Tonight, an animal had become a steward of energy itself, harnessing the power of combustion for its own ends. Tonight, the rules of the game had changed. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with shades of pink and gold, the fire still burned, smaller now, reduced to coals and embers, but alive. The band stirred from sleep, and their first action was not to search for food or water. Their first action was to gather around the fire, to warm themselves, to reassure themselves that it still lived. The dominant male carefully added dry grass and small sticks, nursing the coals back into flame. His technique had improved dramatically over the night. He worked with a concentration that would have been impossible the day before, his mind fully engaged with the task, planning several steps ahead. He was thinking like a human. The sun rose fully, flooding the clearing with light that made their small fire seem insignificant. But they did not abandon it. Some deep instinct told them that this flame was precious. that starting it again from nothing would be difficult or impossible, that it must be preserved. And so they faced a new problem: how to keep the fire alive while they moved through their territory foraging for food. How to carry this miracle with them. How to integrate fire into the pattern of their daily existence. The juvenile, already marked by his role in reviving the coal, picked up a thick branch and held one end in the fire until it caught. Then he lifted it, a torch, humanity's first portable light source. He walked a few steps away from the main fire, and the others watched in amazement as the flame traveled with him. Fire could move. Fire could be carried. Fire could go wherever they went. The implications were staggering, though they could not fully grasp them. But they felt something, a stirring of possibility, a sense that the world had suddenly become larger and more malleable than they had ever imagined. The dominant male made a decision. Half the band would go forage. Half would stay to tend the fire. They would take turns, rotating duties, ensuring that someone was always watching the flame. They would bring food back to share rather than feeding individually throughout the territory. He was inventing civilization's first division of labor, first work schedule, first social contract based on mutual benefit rather than simple dominance hierarchy. As the first foraging party departed, carrying torches for protection, the ones who remained settled around the fire. One of the females discovered that if she placed certain roots near the edge of the coals, they became soft and easier to eat. Another found that the smoke drove away the biting insects that normally plagued them. Discovery was accelerating. Each hour brought new insights. Each insight built upon the last. The flywheel of innovation had begun to turn, and it would not stop turning until it had remade the world beyond recognition. But they did not know this. They knew only that they were warm, that they were safe, that the night had passed without death, and that the fire still burned. It was enough. For now, it was everything. The price of Prometheus. 3 days had passed since the fire first came under their control, and the band had changed in ways both subtle and profound. They no longer scattered across their territory to forage individually. They no longer spent their nights in terror-filled vigilance among the high branches. They no longer lived as their ancestors had lived for millions of years. The fire had become the center of their existence, the axis around which their entire world rotated. And with this new center came new problems, new conflicts, and new dangers that no primate had ever faced before. The dominant male sat beside the flames, his eyes bloodshot from smoke and sleepless nights. The role of firekeeper was killing him slowly. He had not slept for more than brief minutes at a time since that first night. Every time the fire dimmed, panic jolted him awake. Every gust of wind made him leap to shield the flames. Every distant sound in the darkness sent him scrambling to add more fuel. The fire demanded constant attention, constant sacrifice, constant vigilance. It was a jealous master that consumed not just wood, but time, energy, and peace of mind. The dominant male was learning what every civilization would later discover. Progress has a price, and someone must always pay it. But the benefits seemed to justify the cost. The band had not lost a single member to predators since the fire came. They were eating better than ever before, having discovered that many foods became more digestible when heated. Their territory had effectively expanded because they no longer needed to retreat to specific sleeping trees before darkness fell. They could rest anywhere as long as they had the fire. Yet something else was changing, something more insidious and harder to quantify. The social bonds that had held the band together for generations were beginning to strain and warp under the influence of the flame. The second-ranking male, who had thrown the stone that struck the Dinofelis, had been watching the dominant male's decline with calculating eyes. In the Old World, leadership came through physical strength and aggressive displays. But the fire had introduced a new variable. Whoever controlled the fire controlled the band's survival. Physical dominance meant nothing if you could not keep the flames alive. And the second-ranking male had been learning. While the dominant male exhausted himself with constant vigilance, the second-ranking male had been practicing in secret, starting small fires away from the main camp using coals carried in bark containers. He had become skilled at fire-making, perhaps even more skilled than the leader who had first tamed it. On the fourth morning, while the dominant male dozed fitfully beside the dying fire, the second-ranking male made his move. He did not attack physically. He did not need to. Instead, he simply took over the fire-keeping duties, adding fuel with practiced efficiency, nurturing the flames with steady confidence. The band watched this transfer of power with uncertainty. The old hierarchies were breaking down. Strength and aggression were no longer the only paths to leadership. Knowledge mattered now. Skill mattered. The ability to master fire mattered more than the ability to fight. When the dominant male woke and saw what had happened, his first instinct was to attack, to reassert his authority through violence, as his kind had always done. He rose to his full height, beat his chest, and roared his challenge. But the second-ranking male did not respond with matching aggression. Instead, he calmly picked up a burning branch and held it between them. The message was clear. Attack me, and I will use the fire against you. Challenge me, and I will let the flames die. Depose me, and we all freeze in the darkness. It was the first standoff based not on physical threat, but on technological advantage. It was the first time one hominid had used controlled energy as a weapon against his own kind. It was the birth of warfare as we would come to know it. The dominant male, exhausted and outmaneuvered, backed down. He had not been defeated. He had been made obsolete. And in his eyes, for the first time in the history of his species, you could see something that looked remarkably like despair. He retreated to the edge of the group, no longer dominant, no longer central to their survival. Within a day, he would leave the band entirely, wandering off alone to die in the wilderness. The fire had given the band new power, but it had also created the first exile, the first individual cast out not for weakness or sickness, but for failing to adapt to a changing world. Progress had claimed its first victim from within. But the juvenile who had first blown on the coal noticed something the others missed. In their focus on the fire, in their reorganization around this new technology, they had stopped moving through their territory as they once had. They were staying close to the central fire, unwilling to venture far from its safety and warmth. Their world was shrinking even as their power over it grew. And there was something else, something more troubling. The fire consumed wood at a prodigious rate. The area around their camp was becoming stripped of fallen branches and dry vegetation. They were having to venture farther and farther each day to find fuel. What would happen when the nearby fuel was exhausted? Would they have to move? Could they move the fire with them? How far could they travel while keeping it alive? The fire was both liberation and prison. It gave them safety, but demanded that they stay within its circle of light. It provided warmth, but required constant feeding. It frightened predators, but attracted something potentially more dangerous: the attention of other hominid bands. On the fifth day, smoke from their fire drew visitors. They came from the south, a rival band of 8 individuals from a neighboring territory. They had seen the smoke rising above the trees for days, had smelled it on the wind and had finally come to investigate. What they found shocked them into immobility. The band around the fire had changed. They sat upright with confidence. They showed no fear despite being in the open during daylight hours. And most striking of all, they controlled something that should not be controllable. They held the power of lightning in their hands. The visiting band approached cautiously, vocalizing submission and curiosity. The new dominant male, the firekeeper, faced a choice that would echo through history. Would he share the fire? Or would he guard it jealously, keeping this power for his own band alone? His decision came from a place deeper than conscious thought. The fire demanded so much fuel. The fire required so much labor. More hands to gather wood would ease the burden. More eyes to watch the flames would allow him to sleep. More members in the band would mean more security against predators and rivals. But sharing the fire meant sharing power. It meant teaching others the secrets he had learned. It meant spreading the flame beyond his control. He chose to share, not from altruism or generosity, but from the practical calculation that cooperation would strengthen his position. He gestured for the visitors to approach. He showed them how to warm themselves without getting burned. He demonstrated how to feed the flames properly. And in that moment, he became history's first teacher. The first individual to deliberately pass on knowledge not genetically, but culturally, through demonstration and example. Information was being transmitted outside of DNA, through a new pathway that could move 1,000,000 times faster than evolution. The visitors stayed for 2 days, learning the ways of fire. When they left, they carried coals wrapped in green leaves, the embers of revolution that would spread across the landscape like wildfire. But the juvenile watched them go with troubled eyes. He had noticed something during their visit. The strangers had learned quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were tending the fire as competently as band members who had lived with it for days. The advantage that fire had given his band was already evaporating. Soon every band would have fire. And then what? The next advantage. That was what? The next innovation. The next leap forward. The fire had taught them something more profound than warmth or safety. It had taught them that the world could be changed, that nature could be bent to will, that limitations were not absolute. The juvenile began experimenting again. He noticed that certain stones, when struck together near dry grass, produced sparks. Not enough to start a fire reliably, but sometimes, if the grass was perfectly dry and the stones struck just right, a small ember would form. He practiced obsessively, failing hundreds of times, succeeding occasionally, beginning to understand the variables involved. He was inventing fire-making from scratch. He was learning to create flame without needing to preserve it from a previous source. He was achieving what even his bandmates thought impossible, conjuring fire from nothing but stone and will. But this knowledge would take years to perfect. For now, the band remained dependent on keeping their original fire alive, an unbroken chain of flame stretching back to that first coal blown to life 5 days ago. As the sun set on the 5th day, the band gathered around the fire as had become their ritual. The new dominant male added fuel with practiced ease. The females groomed each other in the warmth. The infants played in the flickering light, growing up in a world fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. And in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, the world watched. Other hominid bands saw the smoke and came to investigate. Predators learned to associate the smell of burning wood with danger and began to avoid certain areas. The vegetation around the camp changed as fallen wood was systematically removed. Even the insects adapted, with some species learning to avoid the smoke, while others were attracted to the light. The fire was not just changing the band, it was changing the entire ecosystem. It was creating a new kind of environment, one shaped not by geology or climate, but by the deliberate actions of a thinking species. The first artificial habitat, the first human-altered landscape. And this was just the beginning. One of the older females, her fur singed from getting too close to the flames, made a discovery that would have seemed trivial to the others. She found that if she positioned flat stones around the edge of the fire, they became hot enough to cook food without burning it. She could place roots and tubers on these stones, and they would cook more evenly than in the coals. She had invented the griddle, the oven, the first cooking surface. Food preparation had just become more sophisticated, more controlled, more efficient. Each small innovation led to others. The ability to cook food more thoroughly meant less spoilage and fewer parasites. Better nutrition meant healthier bodies and sharper minds. Sharper minds meant more innovations. The cycle was accelerating, feeding on itself, building momentum that would become unstoppable. But there was a darker side to this progress that none of them could see yet. With each generation that grew up around fire, with each infant that knew only the warmth and safety of the flames, their bodies were changing. Their digestive systems were adapting to cooked food. Their social instincts were rewiring around communal gathering. Their sleep cycles were extending into the night hours. They were becoming dependent on fire in a way that would eventually make it impossible to survive without it. The choice to tame fire was becoming irreversible. There would be no going back to the old ways. The species was committed now to a path that would lead either to dominance over the entire planet or to extinction. There was no middle ground anymore. The fire had seen to that. As the embers glowed in the darkness and the band settled into sleep, the juvenile sat awake, still experimenting with his stones, still chasing the dream of creating fire at will. He did not know that his descendants would achieve this dream. He did not know that they would go on to create fires so large they could be seen from space, to harness combustion in engines that would carry them across continents and eventually to other worlds. He knew only that the fire had revealed a truth. The world was not fixed. Reality could be altered, and the only limit to what was possible was imagination itself. The flame flickered. The juvenile struck his stones together. Sparks flew into the darkness, and somewhere in those sparks danced the shadows of skyscrapers and starships, of cities and civilizations, of all the glory and horror that would flow from this simple discovery made 5.2 million years ago in a clearing in Africa. The fire burned on, and the world would never be the same. The language of flame. 2 lunar cycles had passed since the fire first came into their keeping, and the band had grown. 23 individuals now gathered around the flames each night, a merger of 3 separate groups drawn together by the magnetic pull of this new technology. But with growth came complexity, and with complexity came the need for something that had never existed before: sophisticated communication. The problem revealed itself gradually. With only 12 individuals, coordinating fire-keeping duties had been simple. Gestures and simple vocalizations sufficed. But with 23 mouths to feed, 23 bodies to protect, and a fire that demanded constant attention, The old methods of communication were breaking down. Misunderstandings led to conflicts. Conflicts led to inefficiency. Inefficiency threatened their survival. The juvenile, now recognized by the band as someone special, someone whose insights often proved valuable, sat apart from the main group one evening, watching the interactions around the fire with unusually focused attention. He saw the firekeeper trying to explain to a newcomer how to properly bank the coals for the night. The explanation involved frantic gestures, repeated demonstrations, and growing frustration on both sides. There had to be a better way. The juvenile began to experiment with sounds, not the emotional hoots and screams that came naturally, but deliberate, controlled vocalizations. He pointed at the fire and made a specific sound. Fa. He repeated it. Fa. Fa. Others looked at him strangely, but he persisted. He pointed at wood and made another sound. Wa. At water. Wa. He was assigning labels. He was creating the first vocabulary. He was inventing language itself. The concept spread slowly at first. Most of the band continued using traditional communication methods. But the younger members, their brains more plastic and receptive to novelty, began adopting the juvenile's word sounds. Within days, a rudimentary lexicon had emerged. Fire, wood, water, food, danger, come, go, sleep, wake. 12 words. Just 12 simple labels for the most essential elements of their existence. But those 12 words changed everything. For the first time, they could plan. Not just react to immediate circumstances, but discuss what would happen tomorrow, next week, next season. The firekeeper could tell specific individuals to gather wood for tonight, while others collected food for morning. He could explain complex procedures for maintaining the fire during rainstorms. He could pass on knowledge with precision impossible through mere demonstration. Language was amplifying their collective intelligence exponentially. What one individual learned could now be transmitted to all with unprecedented accuracy. Innovations that might have died with their inventor could now spread through the group and across generations. Culture was accelerating. But language brought unexpected complications. With the ability to make plans came the ability to make promises. And with promises came the possibility of lies. One of the younger males, ambitious and clever, discovered that he could use words to deceive. He told the firekeeper he would gather wood, but instead spent the afternoon searching for ripe fruit for himself. When confronted, he claimed he had misunderstood the instructions. The firekeeper had no way to prove otherwise. Deception had always existed in the animal kingdom. Camouflage, mimicry, feigned injury to draw predators away from nests. But this was different. This was deliberate, abstract deception using symbolic communication. This was lying as we would recognize it. And lying required something profound. The ability to understand that others have minds, that those minds contain beliefs, and that those beliefs can be manipulated through false information. Theory of mind, recursive thinking, consciousness of consciousness. The liar had just proven that these early hominids were not merely clever animals. They were self-aware beings, capable of modeling other minds, of understanding that their companions had inner lives similar to their own. They had crossed another threshold, one that separated them forever from the rest of the animal kingdom. But this new capability came with costs. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. Social interactions became more complex, more strategic, more exhausting. The band needed new mechanisms for maintaining cooperation in the face of potential deception. The firekeeper, frustrated by the young male's lie, did something unprecedented. He called the entire band together around the fire and explained what had happened. He pointed at the liar and made sounds that conveyed betrayal, anger, and disappointment. The message was clear. This individual had broken the social contract. The group's response shocked the liar. They turned away from him. They refused to share food. They denied him prime sleeping spots near the fire. He had not been physically attacked or exiled, but he had been punished nonetheless, through collective social rejection. Reputation had just been invented. Public shaming, community enforcement of behavioral norms. These early hominids had created civilization's first justice system, enforced not through violence, but through coordinated social pressure. The liar, chastened and isolated, spent 3 miserable days on the periphery of the group, before finally performing an elaborate series of submissive gestures and vocalizations that seemed to convey apology. The firekeeper, after consulting with the older females, accepted this submission. The liar was readmitted to the group, though with a tarnished reputation that would follow him for months. Forgiveness had entered the world, second chances, redemption. The social fabric had proven flexible enough to accommodate transgression without tearing apart completely. Meanwhile, the juvenile continued his linguistic experiments. He discovered that sounds could be combined to create new meanings. Fa plus w could mean wood for fire or burning wood, depending on context and tone. He was inventing grammar, the rules that would allow infinite meanings to be generated from finite elements. One evening, he made a breakthrough that would echo through the millennia. He pointed at the fire and made it sound, fa. Then he pointed at the sky, where the sun had just set, and made the same sound. The others looked confused. Fire was fire. The sun was the sun. They were different things. But the juvenile persisted. He gestured between the fire and the remembered position of the sun. He made the sound again, fa. He was trying to communicate something abstract, that the fire and the sun shared a quality, that they were both sources of light and heat, that they belonged to the same category despite being different objects. He was inventing metaphor, abstract categorization, the ability to see similarities across differences, to group things by properties rather than identity, to think in concepts rather than concrete objects. This was the birth of abstract thought as we know it. And with abstract thought came the possibility of science, philosophy, mathematics, and every other intellectual achievement that would follow. But most of the band did not understand what the juvenile was trying to communicate. The leap was too great, too abstract, too far removed from immediate survival concerns. Only one other individual seemed to grasp it, a young female who had been watching the juvenile's experiments with quiet fascination. She approached the fire, pointed at it, and made the sound, fa. Then she pointed at her own body and placed her hand over her chest, where warmth radiated. Fa, she said softly. She understood. Warmth. Heat. The fire created it. The sun created it. Her body contained it. They were connected by this invisible property. The juvenile felt something he had never experienced before. The joy of being understood, of having a thought acknowledged by another mind, of intellectual companionship. He and the young female sat together, pointing at objects, making sounds, testing whether their internal mental categories aligned. They were having humanity's first philosophical discussion. the first meeting of minds in the realm of pure ideas rather than immediate practical concerns. As the weeks passed, language continued to evolve. New words emerged daily. The vocabulary grew to 50 terms, then 100. Simple two-word combinations gave way to three-word and four-word structures. Past, present, and future began to be distinguished through tonal variations and context. And with this expanding language came expanding consciousness. The ability to name things changed how they experienced reality. Before language, the world was a continuous stream of sensation and immediate reaction. After language, the world became divided into discrete objects and concepts that could be contemplated, analyzed, and discussed. They were no longer simply living in the present moment as all animals do. They were beginning to exist in time itself, able to remember the past with new clarity and imagine possible futures with unprecedented detail. One night, as the band sat around the fire, one of the older females began making rhythmic sounds, not quite words, but not quite random vocalizations either. Others joined in, creating a pattern, a cadence, something that felt significant, even though it conveyed no specific information. They were singing, or at least they were creating the precursor to song, using their new vocal control not for communication, but for pure aesthetic pleasure. Art was being born. The firekeeper, listening to this proto-music, felt an emotion he could not name. The sounds stirred something deep within him, something that transcended survival or practical benefit. He felt connected to the others in a way that went beyond mere pack cooperation. He felt part of something larger than himself. He was experiencing culture, shared meaning, collective identity. The fire had brought them together physically, but language was binding them together spiritually, creating invisible threads of shared understanding that were stronger than any physical bond. But even as language united the band, it also revealed the terrifying scope of their ignorance. With the ability to ask questions came the realization of how little they understood. Why did the fire burn? Where did the sun go at night? What made the rain fall? What happened to individuals when they died? These questions had no answers, and the lack of answers created anxiety, uncertainty, a gnawing sense that the world contained mysteries beyond their comprehension. The juvenile, lying awake one night while others slept, stared at the stars and felt overwhelmed by questions he could barely formulate. The fire had given them power over their immediate environment. Language had given them power to share knowledge. But neither could explain the fundamental nature of reality itself. He needed answers, and in the absence of true answers, his mind began generating stories. Perhaps the stars were fires in the sky, tended by invisible beings. Perhaps the sun was a great flame that traveled beneath the earth at night. Perhaps lightning was fire thrown by something powerful and angry. He was inventing mythology, creating narratives to fill the gaps in understanding, building mental models of reality that, while inaccurate, provided comfort and the illusion of comprehension. The next day, he shared these stories with the young female who understood his abstractions. She listened, considered, and then added her own elaborations. Perhaps the beings that tended the sky fires were like them, but greater. Perhaps these beings had given them the first fire. Perhaps they watched from above, judging whether the band was worthy of this gift. Religion was being conceived in these tentative stories, this attempt to make sense of existence through narrative and supernatural explanation. The stories were wrong, of course, laughably primitive compared to the scientific understanding that would eventually emerge. But they served a vital function. They gave meaning to suffering, purpose to existence, and structure to the chaos of reality. Within weeks, these proto-myths had spread through the entire band. They were being elaborated, refined, passed down to the young ones as truths rather than speculations. The stories were becoming sacred, beyond questioning, too important to doubt. And the juvenile, watching his simple speculations transform into dogma, felt the first stirrings of what might be called intellectual humility. His stories had been just that, stories, guesses, attempts to explain. But they were being treated as revealed truth. He tried to explain that these were merely possibilities, not certainties. But the band needed certainty. They needed to believe that someone or something understood the mysteries, even if they themselves did not. Doubt was uncomfortable. Faith was comforting. The juvenile learned a hard lesson. Sometimes lies we tell ourselves are more powerful than truths we discover. Sometimes comfort matters more than accuracy. Sometimes humanity chooses beautiful falsehood over harsh reality. But he did not give up his questioning. Even as the band embraced mythology, he continued experimenting, observing, testing his understanding against reality. He noticed that certain plants grew better in soil enriched by fire ash. He observed that smoke rose while heat radiated outward. He cataloged which woods burned longest, which created the most light, which produced the least smoke. He was doing science even before science had a name. And slowly, very slowly, his observations were building a genuine understanding of the natural world, one based not on comforting stories, but on repeatable patterns and testable predictions. Two paths were diverging in front of humanity: the path of faith and the path of reason, the path of myth and the path of science, the path of beautiful stories and the path of difficult truths. Both paths would prove essential to survival. Both would shape the species in profound ways. And both originated here, around this fire, in these first fumbling attempts to make sense of existence. The fire crackled. The band sang their songs and told their stories. The juvenile watched and wondered and questioned. And language flowed between them all, that miraculous gift that separated them from every other species on Earth, that allowed them to share minds across space and time, that made them truly human at last. The flame had given them power, but language had given them something far more dangerous: the ability to imagine. And imagination, for better and worse, would prove to be the most transformative force in the history of the world. The fire spreads. 6 moons had waxed and waned since that first accidental discovery, and the African landscape was transforming in ways both visible and invisible. Smoke rose from dozens of locations across the savanna, each column marking a band of hominids who had obtained fire through gift, theft, or their own desperate experimentation. The revolution was spreading faster than any biological adaptation could have traveled, leaping across populations through culture rather than genes. But this proliferation brought consequences that no one had anticipated. The juvenile, now approaching physical maturity, stood on a hill overlooking the territory his band had claimed. In the distance, he could count 7 distinct smoke plumes. 7 other bands, all competing for the same resources that fire demanded. The forests around each settlement were being stripped of deadfall and dry wood. Territories that once supported multiple bands in peaceful coexistence were now contested battlegrounds where access to fuel meant survival. Fire had created an arms race, and the stakes were nothing less than existence itself. The band that controlled the best wood sources thrived. Their fires burned bright and steady through the night. Their members slept soundly, protected from predators by walls of flame. They cooked their food thoroughly, suffering fewer parasites and diseases. Their children grew stronger. Their adults lived longer. Their population expanded. But bands without adequate fuel struggled desperately. Their fires guttered and died in the night. Predators returned to stalk them in the darkness. Food shortages forced them to spend more time foraging and less time maintaining their flames. A vicious cycle had begun, where success bred success and failure compounded failure. The juvenile watched as a neighboring band's fire went out completely one morning. He saw their panic, heard their desperate vocalizations carrying across the valley. They had failed to keep the flame alive, and now they faced a terrible choice: humble themselves and beg for fire from a rival band, or attempt to survive without it, returning to a way of life that was already becoming impossible. They chose to beg. The leader of the neighboring band approached the juvenile's firekeeper the next day, carrying offerings of food and making elaborate submissive gestures. The message was clear: please share your fire, and we will give you whatever you ask. The firekeeper faced a decision that would establish a pattern repeating throughout human history. He could share the fire freely, strengthening the neighboring band and potentially creating an ally. Or he could demand payment, tribute, subservience in exchange for this life-giving resource. He chose the latter. The neighboring band became subordinates, required to deliver a portion of their foraged food each day in exchange for continued access to fire. They had to ask permission before taking coals. They were relegated to sleeping spots farther from the flames. They had become, in essence, a servant class. Inequality had entered the world. Social stratification based not on strength or age, but on control of resources and technology. The first economic system had been born, built on debt, tribute, and the unequal distribution of a vital commodity. The juvenile watched this unfold with a mixture of fascination and unease. The fire had liberated them from the tyranny of darkness, but it had created new forms of tyranny to replace it. Power was concentrating in the hands of those who controlled fire knowledge and fuel resources. The weak were becoming weaker, the strong stronger, and the gap between them widened with each passing day. But he also saw opportunity in this inequality. The subordinate band, desperate to improve their position, were willing to try anything. When the juvenile approached them with his idea for creating fire from stones, they listened with intense attention. They became his first students, his first collaborators, his first research team. Together, they worked obsessively on the problem of fire-making. The juvenile had learned that striking certain stones together produced sparks. But sparks alone were not enough. They needed to be captured, nurtured, transformed into sustainable flame. The process required perfect conditions: absolutely dry tinder, rapid striking at the correct angle, immediate but gentle feeding of the embryonic flame. Failure rate was 99%. But that 1% success was revolutionary. After weeks of experimentation, the juvenile achieved reliable fire-making. He could create flame from nothing but stone, wood, and skill. He no longer needed to preserve fire from a previous source or beg coals from others. He had broken the chain of dependency that had enslaved bands to their original flames. The implications were staggering. Any band with this knowledge could survive without begging or trading for fire. They could split off from larger groups without fear. They could migrate to new territories without worrying about keeping flames alive during travel. They could recover from the disaster of an extinguished fire within hours rather than days or weeks. The juvenile had invented independence, self-sufficiency, the ability to start over. But he kept this knowledge secret initially, sharing it only with the subordinate band who had helped develop it. Together, they planned. When the time was right, when they had stockpiled enough resources and practiced the technique until it was nearly foolproof, they would leave. They would establish their own territory, their own fire, their own destiny. They would be free. The firekeeper noticed the whispering between the juvenile and the subordinate band members, but dismissed it as insignificant. He had grown complacent in his power, confident that his control of fire made him indispensable. He did not understand that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be unlearned. That technology, once invented, cannot be uninvented. That power based solely on exclusive access to resources is inherently unstable. On a morning when the firekeeper and most of the dominant band had gone to hunt for a small herd of gazelle spotted nearby, the subordinate band made their move. They gathered their meager possessions, took no coals or embers, and simply walked away. By the time the hunters returned, they were gone. The firekeeper was furious, but not concerned. Without fire, the subordinates would be back within days, groveling for coals, willing to accept even harsher terms. He would make an example of them, he decided. He would show everyone what happened to those who defied his authority. But days passed, and the subordinates did not return. Weeks went by. Smoke began rising from a distant hill where the subordinates had established their camp. They had fire. Somehow, impossibly, they had created their own flame. The firekeeper's monopoly had been broken. His leverage had evaporated. The subordinate band, free of tribute obligations, began to thrive. Other oppressed groups took notice. Within a lunar cycle, 2 more bands had left, carrying with them the knowledge of fire-making that they had obtained through observation, theft, or trade. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. The fire-making technique spread across the landscape like the flames themselves, jumping from band to band, carried by those seeking freedom from domination or simply hungry for independence. But the juvenile took no satisfaction in this liberation. He had observed something troubling during the subordinates' departure. They had been followed, not by members of the dominant band seeking to stop them, but by predators who had learned a new hunting strategy. The great cats and pack hunters had noticed a pattern. Bands in transition, bands without established fire circles, bands focused on travel rather than vigilance were vulnerable in ways that settled groups were not. A new form of predation had emerged, targeting not individuals but entire groups during their most vulnerable moments. And there was something else, something even more disturbing. The rapid expansion of fire-using bands across the landscape was having visible environmental effects. Entire groves of trees had been stripped of deadfall. The vegetation structure was changing as bands cleared undergrowth to create defensible fire circles. Small fires, whether through accident or intent, were escaping control and scorching patches of savanna. The hominids were becoming an ecological force. They were no longer simply living within the environment, they were reshaping it. And the environment was beginning to push back. Game animals were becoming scarce near fire circle settlements. They had learned to associate smoke with danger and were migrating away from areas of dense hominid occupation. This forced the bands to range farther for food, creating conflicts over hunting territories that had previously been shared peacefully. The first interband violence over resources erupted on a morning that had dawned clear and beautiful. Two foraging parties, one from the juvenile's band and one from a neighboring group, arrived simultaneously at a fallen tree known to be prime habitat for edible grubs. Both parties needed the protein. Both parties claimed the tree was in their territory. Words were exchanged. Threats were made. And then, for the first time in the history of their species, one hominid deliberately struck another with a stone tool. Not in dominance display or mating competition, but in calculated violence over resources. The wounded hominid fell, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. His bandmates rushed to his aid, while the attackers fled, carrying as many grubs as they could gather. The violence had been brief, almost tentative, as if neither side quite believed what had happened. But it had happened, and it would happen again. Competition for resources, intensified by fire's demands, had crossed a threshold into deliberate intergroup violence. Warfare, still primitive and opportunistic, had been born. The juvenile, hearing about the incident, felt a deep unease settling over him. The fire had given them so much: safety from predators, warmth against the cold, the ability to cook food and extend their range, the foundation for language, culture, and technology. But it had also created new dangers, new conflicts, new ways to suffer and die. Progress, he was learning, was not a simple story of improvement. It was a complex web of gains and losses, of problems solved and new problems created, of liberation in one domain purchased with constraint in another. The fire had freed them from the darkness, but it had bound them to fuel. It had protected them from predators, but it had made them threats to each other. That night, as he sat beside the flames that he could now create at will, the juvenile contemplated the weight of knowledge. He had given his band independence through fire-making, but had he given them freedom or just a different form of bondage? They were no longer slaves to a firekeeper, true, but they were now slaves to the constant need for fuel, for territory, for resources to sustain the flames. And the violence would only get worse. He could see it coming as clearly as he could see the stars wheeling overhead. As bands proliferated and territories filled, conflicts would intensify. The desperate would take from the strong would dominate the weak. And fire, that great gift that had elevated them above the animals, would become a weapon as deadly as any fang or claw. One of the elders approached the juvenile as he sat lost in thought. The old female had been watching him since he first blew on that coal moons ago. She had seen something in him that set him apart, a quality of mind that was new in the world. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence a comfort. They watched the fire together in companionable silence. Finally, she made a sound, one of the new words. Why? It was a question she had never asked before, a question that perhaps had never been asked before. Not what or where or how, but why. A question about purpose, about meaning, about the reason behind existence. The juvenile had no answer. How could he? The question was too vast, too profound, too far beyond the grasp of minds just beginning to awaken to their own consciousness. But he appreciated the question itself. It meant he was not alone in his wondering, not alone in his sense that there was something more to existence than mere survival. He pointed at the fire and made several sounds, stringing together words in a way that approached true sonnet structure. Fire, change, everything. The elder nodded slowly. Yes, fire had changed everything. But she made sounds back. Fire, change, us? The juvenile felt a chill despite the warmth of the flames. She was asking whether they were still the same creatures who had lived without fire, or whether the fire had transformed them into something new. It was a question of identity, of continuity, of whether they were still themselves or had become other. He had no answer to that either, but the question haunted him. As more moons passed, the transformation continued accelerating. The landscape filled with smoke plumes. Conflicts over resources intensified. Innovations in fire use spread rapidly through the population. Some bands learned to use fire to drive game animals toward hunters. Others discovered that certain plants, when thrown on flames, produced smoke that could preserve meat. Still others found that fire could harden the tips of wooden spears, making them more effective weapons. Each innovation built on the last. Each success inspired new experiments. The pace of change was becoming exponential, far outstripping the slow grind of biological evolution. And through it all, the fires burned. On hilltops and in valleys, beside streams and under ancient trees, the flames flickered and danced. Each fire was a beacon of consciousness, a proclamation that thinking beings had claimed this territory, that the darkness had been pushed back, that nature itself had been conquered. But nature is not so easily conquered, and the fires that had given the hominids such power were about to teach them a terrible lesson about the law of unintended consequences. The dry season was approaching, and the landscape was tinder-box ready. The countless small fires, some carefully tended and some carelessly managed, were about to merge into something far beyond anyone's control. The juvenile, with his gift for observation and pattern recognition, saw it coming. He watched the grass turn brown and brittle. He felt the wind picking up, hot and dry from the north. He saw how the fires were becoming harder to contain, how sparks carried farther, how the margins of safety were shrinking. He tried to warn the firekeeper, but his concerns were dismissed. Fire was their servant, their tool, their salvation. It would never turn against them. But fire, as they were about to discover, served no master. Fire followed only the laws of combustion, of heat and fuel and oxygen. And when conditions were right, fire would consume everything in its path, heedless of who had created it or who tried to control it. The great burning was coming, and it would remind these early humans of a truth that every civilization would eventually learn and relearn through bitter experience. The tools we create to serve us can become our masters. The fire we kindle can consume us.
And progress, unchecked and uncontrolled, can destroy as readily as it creates. The smoke rose higher each day. The wind grew stronger. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spark that would set the world ablaze. And in their fire circles across the savanna, the hominids tended their flames, confident in their mastery, unaware of the inferno gathering on the horizon. The day of reckoning was at hand, the great burning. The wind came first, 3 days before the fire. It blew from the north, hot and relentless, carrying with it the scent of distant smoke and the promise of catastrophe. The grasses, already brittle from weeks without rain, bent and whispered secrets of destruction. The air itself felt combustible, as if the world was holding its breath before screaming. The juvenile felt it in his bones, a primal warning that transcended rational thought. He spent those 3 days trying to convince the firekeeper to extinguish their flames, to eliminate the danger before it could consume them. But the firekeeper would not listen. To extinguish the fire voluntarily was unthinkable, a surrender of everything they had gained, a return to the terror of darkness and vulnerability. So the fires continued burning. Across the savanna, in dozens of settlements, the flames flickered and danced, each one a potential spark for apocalypse. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, smoke appeared on the northern horizon. Not the vertical columns of controlled fires, but a massive wall of gray and black that stretched across the entire visible world. The wind carried the roar of distant combustion, a sound like thunder that never stopped, like the voice of some ancient and terrible god awakening after eons of sleep. The great burning had begun. It started, ironically, at a settlement where hominids had been trying to use fire to clear undergrowth and create a larger defensive perimeter. The flames had escaped their control, leaping into the dry grass and accelerating with terrifying speed. Within minutes, what had been a small, manageable fire had become a racing inferno, consuming everything in its path and generating its own wind as superheated air rose and pulled in oxygen from all directions. The hominids at that settlement had run, abandoning everything, fleeing south ahead of the flames. But the fire moved faster than any living thing could run for long. Some made it to rocky outcrops where there was nothing to burn. Others reached rivers and plunged into the water, submerging themselves to escape the heat. Many did not make it at all. And the fire spread. It jumped from grass to bush to tree, creating a front that stretched for miles, advancing with implacable certainty toward every settlement, every band, every living thing that could not escape or hide. The juvenile's band saw it coming and made a decision that split them in two. Half, led by the firekeeper, refused to abandon their fire circle. They would defend it, they declared, would fight the approaching flames with their own controlled burns, would trust in the fire that had protected them for so long. The other half, led by the juvenile, chose to run. They gathered the children and the elderly, took nothing but their knowledge and each other, and fled south toward a series of caves the juvenile remembered from childhood explorations. The firekeeper watched them go with contempt in his eyes. Cowards, he called them. Abandoning the fire was abandoning everything that made them strong, everything that separated them from the animals. He and his followers would stay and prove that humans could master even this, could control even catastrophe itself. It was the last time the two groups would see each other alive. The juvenile led his people through the tall grass, moving as quickly as the slowest member could manage. Behind them, the wall of smoke grew closer, darker,
more menacing with each passing hour. The heat intensified. Ash began falling from the sky like gray snow. The animals of the savanna were fleeing too, a mass exodus of prey and predator alike, ancient enmities forgotten in the face of a threat that recognized no distinctions. A young mother stumbled and fell, her infant tumbling from her arms. The juvenile stopped, helped her up, took the child himself, and carried it, despite the extra burden slowing him down. Others in the group helped the elderly, supported the weak, shared the weight of survival. The fire had taught them many things, but perhaps the most important was this: they survived together or died alone. As darkness fell, they were still hours away from the caves. The fire behind them was a visible wall now, a horizon of flame that painted the sky orange and red and terrible gold. The roar was deafening. The heat was becoming unbearable even at this distance. Burning embers carried by the wind were starting small spot fires ahead of them, cutting off potential escape routes. They were not going to make it to the caves. The juvenile knew this with terrible certainty. They needed another solution, and they needed it now. His mind raced through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as he conceived them. They could not outrun the fire. They could not hide from it. They could not fight it. But perhaps they could use fire against itself. He called the band to a halt in a wide, flat area where the grass was thick and dry. The others looked at him with confusion and fear. This was the worst possible place to stop, completely exposed, surrounded by fuel. Had he lost his mind? But the juvenile was already gathering dried grass and wood, building not one fire, but many, arranged in a circle around the band. He worked with frantic speed, and others, trusting him despite their terror, helped. Within minutes, they had built a ring of small fires surrounding their position. Then the juvenile did something that seemed like madness itself. He set the fires burning not toward the approaching inferno, but outward, away from the band. The flames spread rapidly into the surrounding grass, consuming the fuel, creating an expanding circle of blackened earth. He was fighting fire with fire, creating a burn zone where there was nothing left to burn, a sanctuary of ash in a world of flame. The technique worked, but barely. The fires they set merged and raced outward, clearing the ground in all directions. The band huddled in the center of the burned area, coughing from smoke, terrified of the flames that surrounded them on all sides. For several minutes, they were trapped in a ring of fire of their own making, certain they had simply chosen a different method of death. But the juvenile had calculated correctly. The fires they set burned out quickly, having consumed all available fuel in their immediate vicinity. They were left standing on a patch of scorched earth, perhaps 50 paces across, an island of black in a sea of unburned grass. Just in time. The main fire front arrived moments later, a wall of flame 3 times the height of a standing hominid, generating heat so intense it hurt to breathe. But when it reached the edge of their burn zone, it faltered. There was nothing left to consume. The flames licked at the edges of the blackened earth, searching for fuel, finding none, and flowing around the perimeter like water around a stone. The band stood in the center of their sanctuary, surrounded by an inferno that could not touch them, protected by the very element that threatened to destroy them. They covered their faces against the heat, closed their eyes against the light, and endured. The fire front passed in less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. When the flames had moved on, leaving only smoldering earth and scattered embers in their wake, the band emerged from their refuge into a transformed world. Everything was gone. The landscape that had been lush savanna just hours before was now a desert of ash and char. Trees stood as blackened skeletons. Every trace of vegetation had been erased. The ground itself was still too hot to walk on comfortably. And the smoke hung over everything, turning the sun into a dim red disk, casting the world in apocalyptic twilight. But they were alive. Against all odds, using fire to defeat fire, they had survived what should have been unsurvivable. The juvenile led them carefully across the scorched earth, testing each step, following a route he hoped would lead to unburned areas beyond the fire's path. They walked through the night, through a landscape of ash and ember, passing the charred remains of animals that had not been fast enough or clever enough to escape. And they passed something else, something that made the juvenile stop and stare in horrified fascination. The fire circle, where the firekeeper and his followers had made their stand, was now a scattered collection of bones. The firekeeper had been wrong. Fire could not be fought with simple defiance. The flames did not care about courage or determination or the will to survive. They followed only the laws of physics, consuming fuel wherever they found it, showing no mercy to those who had once thought themselves masters of combustion. The juvenile stood there for a long time, looking at the remains of the leader who had first shared fire with neighboring bands, who had controlled access to this revolutionary technology, who had believed that understanding fire meant controlling it. A hominid who had risen to power through fire and fallen through the same flames that had elevated him. There was a lesson here. The juvenile felt its weight, even though he could not articulate it in words. The tools we create are more powerful than we are. The forces we harness can destroy us as easily as serve us. Confidence in our mastery is often just ignorance of our limitations. He made sounds, words strung together in the most complex sentence structure his language yet allowed. Fire, give. Fire, take. We, small. The others who had survived understood. The fire had given them everything: warmth, safety, cooked food, protection from predators, the foundation of language and culture and technology. But the fire had also taken. It had taken the firekeeper and his followers. It had taken their territory, their familiar landscape, their sense of security. It had shown them that they were not masters of nature, but participants in it, powerful but not invincible, capable but not omnipotent. They continued walking south, into territory that had not burned, where green grass still grew and water still flowed. They were refugees now, displaced by the very technology they had thought would secure their dominance. They would have to rebuild, to start over, to find new territory and establish new fire circles. But they would survive, because they had learned something that the firekeeper had not. They had learned humility. They had learned that respecting the power of their tools was more important than pride in possessing them. They had learned that survival sometimes meant retreat, that wisdom sometimes meant surrender, that the strongest response to overwhelming force was not defiance, but adaptation. As dawn broke over the devastated landscape, the band reached a river that had served as a natural firebreak. Beyond it, the world was still green, still alive, untouched by the great burning. They crossed carefully, leaving the charred wasteland behind, entering into a new territory that would become their home. The juvenile carried no fire with him. Their flames had been abandoned in the flight, left to die or merge with the inferno.
But he carried something more valuable: the knowledge of how to create fire from stone and wood. He no longer needed to preserve an unbroken chain of flame stretching back to that first accidental discovery. He could create it anew whenever needed. That afternoon, in their new territory, he demonstrated the technique to the entire band. Striking stones together, catching sparks in dry grass, nursing the ember into flame. It took several attempts, but eventually, a small fire flickered into existence. The band gathered around it, warming themselves, taking comfort in the familiar glow. But their relationship with fire had changed. They no longer took it for granted. They maintained careful fire breaks around their circle. They kept watch to ensure no sparks escaped into the surrounding vegetation. They treated fire with the respect and caution it demanded. No longer as a servant, but as a partner, powerful and dangerous in equal measure. The Great Burning had taught them wisdom that would echo through millennia. Every civilization that followed would have to learn the same lesson, often through similar catastrophes. The tools we create can exceed our ability to control them. Progress, unchecked, becomes destruction. Power without responsibility leads to ruin. But they had also learned something else, something more hopeful. They had learned that humans could adapt, could innovate under pressure, could find solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. The juvenile's insight to fight fire with fire had saved them. It was crude, desperate, barely successful, but it worked. And that success proved something fundamental about their species. They were survivors. Not through strength or speed or natural weapons, but through thinking, through creativity, through the ability to see connections and imagine solutions. The fire had awakened their minds, and those minds had proven equal to the challenge it presented. Over the following moons, the scorched landscape began to recover. New grass sprouted from roots that had survived underground. Trees sent up shoots from charred trunks. Animals returned to graze on the fresh growth. The Great Burning, terrible as it had been, had also cleared away old, decadent vegetation and made way for new life. The cycle continued: destruction and renewal, death and rebirth. The eternal pattern of nature, into which fire fit as naturally as rain or wind or the changing of seasons. The juvenile's band grew and thrived in their new territory. Other survivors from the burning found them and joined, sharing stories of terror and survival, adding their knowledge to the collective pool. The language continued evolving, now including words for concepts like future and planning and caution. The culture deepened, incorporating lessons learned through catastrophe. And the fires burned. But now they burned with greater care, tended by hominids who understood both the gift and the curse they had been given. Years passed. The juvenile grew into full adulthood, then into middle age, then into the status of elder. He taught the fire-making technique to every youngster in the band, ensuring the knowledge would outlive him. He told stories of the Great Burning, keeping the memory alive, passing on the hard-won wisdom to those who had not experienced it directly. He lived to see the next generation come of age, hominids who had never known a world without fire, for whom controlled combustion was as natural as breathing. They took fire for granted in a way his generation never could.
but they also wielded it with greater skill, inventing new techniques, finding new applications, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. On his last night, the juvenile sat beside a fire that his great-grandchildren had built and tended. The flames danced exactly as they had danced all those years ago when he first blew on a coal and brought it back to life. His body was failing, his breath growing shallow, but his mind remained clear. He looked at the young ones around the fire and made sounds, the complex language they all now spoke. Remember, fire is gift. Fire is teacher. Fire is danger. Respect fire. Survive. They nodded, not fully understanding, the way youth never fully understands the warnings of the old. But some understanding remained. Some wisdom was transmitted. The chain continued. As his eyes closed for the last time, the juvenile saw in the flames a vision of the future. He saw fires too numerous to count, saw structures rising toward the sky, saw lights that were not flames, but something else entirely, something his mind could not comprehend. He saw his distant descendants reaching beyond the sky itself, carrying fire to the stars. He could not know if this vision was prophecy or merely the hallucinations of a dying brain, but it gave him comfort. His species would survive. The line would continue. The fire would burn on, tended by hands he would never know, warming beings he could not imagine, serving purposes beyond his comprehension. The fire had changed everything, but in the end, the fire was just a tool. What mattered was the minds that wielded it, the hands that shaped it, the wisdom that governed its use. The flames flickered. The juvenile's breathing stopped. The band mourned, making sounds of grief that were also songs, complex vocalizations that expressed emotion and told stories and created meaning from loss. And life continued. The sun rose the next morning on a world transformed beyond recognition from the one that had existed just a few years before. The fire had spread across the landscape, carried by migrating bands, passed from group to group, becoming ubiquitous. Everywhere hominids gathered, fire burned. The predators had adapted or gone extinct. The prey animals had learned to avoid the smoke. The vegetation had changed, evolving in response to the new fire regime. The very climate was beginning to shift, as smoke and ash accumulated in the atmosphere. The world would never be the same. And the hominids, who had discovered fire by accident, who had learned to control it through trial and error, who had been transformed by it from clever animals into something approaching human, would continue their journey toward an unimaginable future. 5.2 million years later, their descendants would stand on the surface of the moon, looking back at Earth, seeing a world illuminated by billions of fires, both natural and artificial. They would have harnessed nuclear fire, the same power that fueled the stars themselves. They would have built civilizations and destroyed them, created wonders and horrors, reached heights of achievement and depths of destruction that the juvenile could never have conceived. But it all began here, in this clearing, with this fire, with 12 hominids who stumbled into a discovery that changed the trajectory of life itself. The fire crackled, the flames danced, and somewhere in that dance, past and future merged. connected by an unbroken chain of light stretching across the ages. The story of fire is the story of humanity. The story of humanity is the story of fire. They cannot be separated. From that first accidental discovery to the furthest reaches of human achievement, fire has been there, warming, illuminating, destroying, transforming. The gift, the curse, the teacher, the servant, the master, the beginning of everything. The flames burn on. They will always burn on, until the last human hand tends the last human fire beneath the last human sky. And even then, perhaps, the memory will remain. The knowledge will persist. The understanding that once, long ago, a species looked into the darkness and decided to create light. That decision changed everything. That decision made us human. The fire burns. The story continues. And the world, forever altered, spins on through the darkness of space, a small blue marble illuminated by countless fires, carrying the descendants of those first fire makers toward whatever destiny awaits. The end is also the beginning. The fire that destroyed the old world created the new. The flames that threatened extinction enabled survival. The tool that seemed like magic became science. The accident became purpose. The animals became human. All because of fire. All because 5.2 million years ago, a curious juvenile blew on a dying coal and brought it back to life. Everything changed in that moment. Everything. And the fire burns on.